There are places where weather becomes more than atmospheric phenomenon, where precipitation isn't just interruption to outdoor plans or source of agricultural sustenance but is fundamental element of collective identity and daily rhythm, where the patterns of rainfall shape not just the physical landscape but also the emotional and cultural life of the community that experiences those patterns as constant backdrop to existence. Eldermist was such a place, small town of approximately 8,000 residents located in coastal region where orographic lifting and maritime influence created weather patterns that brought rain approximately 240 days per year, where the distinction wasn't between rainy and dry seasons but rather between lighter persistent drizzle and heavier downpours, where residents' relationship to precipitation was intimate and complex in ways that outsiders who visited during rare clear periods couldn't fully understand or appreciate. The town's name itself, Eldermist, referenced this meteorological character, though the origins of the name were disputed among local historians who debated whether elder referred to elderly residents who'd supposedly lived here since the town's 18th century founding or whether it was corruption of older term from language spoken by indigenous people who'd inhabited the region before European settlement. Regardless of etymological origins, the mist portion was undeniably accurate, referred to the persistent fine rain and fog that characterized the town's atmosphere during large portions of the year, that created particular visual quality where distant objects faded into gray-white obscurity and where close objects gained heightened clarity and vividness that made ordinary scenes feel more intense and immediate than they might appear under clearer skies. The rain shaped the town's physical character in visible ways. The buildings were predominantly constructed from materials that weathered well under constant moisture, brick and stone rather than wood that would rot, slate roofs rather than asphalt shingles that would deteriorate, extensive use of covered walkways and arcades that allowed pedestrians to move between buildings while remaining partially sheltered from precipitation. The streets were engineered with sophisticated drainage systems that prevented flooding even during the heaviest downpours, featured permeable surfaces that allowed water to infiltrate rather than creating runoff, included raised crosswalks and strategic placement of storm drains that minimized the depth of standing water even during peak rainfall. The commercial district, concentrated along Main Street and the three parallel blocks that constituted Eldermist's downtown, featured businesses whose operations acknowledged the town's wet climate. Multiple umbrella shops selling not just cheap disposable models but quality handcrafted umbrellas that residents would maintain and repair over years of use. Coffee shops and tea rooms that served as gathering spaces where people would wait out heavier downpours while consuming hot beverages. Bookstores and craft shops that catered to indoor leisure activities that the weather encouraged. The neon signs mentioned in descriptions of the town weren't garish Las Vegas-style displays but rather modest glowing signage that created pools of colored light on wet pavement, soft blues and greens and amber tones that were reflected and multiplied by the perpetually damp street surfaces. The rain also shaped the town's cultural and social life in less tangible but equally significant ways. Residents developed particular relationship to precipitation that combined acceptance with occasional frustration, that involved neither the romantic celebration of rain that characterized some artistic representations nor the constant complaint about weather that characterized some other communities, but rather a pragmatic accommodation that integrated rain into daily life as normal condition requiring appropriate responses but not requiring extensive emotional reaction. People dressed in layers with waterproof outer garments that could be easily removed when entering buildings, carried umbrellas as routinely as they might carry keys or phones, scheduled outdoor activities with awareness that they might need to be adapted or relocated based on rainfall intensity but without assuming that rain necessitated complete cancellation. Into this environment of constant precipitation and pragmatic accommodation, Maya Kapoor had been born 16 years earlier, had lived her entire life within Eldermist's boundaries, had developed relationship to rain that was more complex and emotionally resonant than the general population's practical acceptance. For Maya, rain wasn't just weather to be managed or backdrop to be acknowledged, was presence that carried emotional significance, that created moods and atmospheres that she experienced intensely, that seemed to communicate something beyond its physical properties of water falling from sky through gravitational and atmospheric processes. Maya lived with her parents and younger brother in modest two-story house on Residential Street approximately 6 blocks from downtown, house that had been built in the 1960s and that featured the practical rain-adapted design characteristic of Eldermist architecture, covered front porch, steep roof pitched to shed water efficiently, good insulation to maintain warmth despite the dampness that characterized much of the year. The house's attic had been partially converted into storage space but remained largely unused, featured exposed beams and wooden floorboards and single small window that provided limited natural light, was accessed through pull-down ladder from the second-floor hallway. This attic had become Maya's studio approximately 2 years earlier, when she'd been 14 and had been developing serious interest in visual art beyond the basic instruction provided in school art classes. She'd claimed the space without formal negotiation with her parents, had just gradually started spending more time up there, had brought up old easel and supplies purchased with money saved from occasional babysitting work, had arranged the space to accommodate her painting practice while still leaving room for the boxes and seasonal items her family stored there. Her parents were aware she used the attic but weren't particularly informed about the extent or nature of her artistic work, would occasionally ask in general terms about her painting but didn't press for details when Maya responded vaguely, respected her apparent desire for privacy around this aspect of her life. The privacy was essential to Maya's creative process. She discovered through early attempts at painting in more visible locations that awareness of potential observation disrupted her ability to work freely, created self-consciousness that made her second-guess her choices and that prevented her from accessing the emotional states that seemed necessary for producing work that felt meaningful rather than just technically adequate. The attic's isolation, physical separation from the main living spaces of the house, the fact that accessing it required deliberate choice to climb the ladder rather than just passing by, created protective boundary that allowed Maya to work without worrying about unexpected interruptions or about family members casually observing her process. The work itself had evolved gradually from general landscape painting and still life exercises toward increasing focus on rain as subject and as emotional content. The evolution hadn't been deliberate strategy or conscious artistic decision but had emerged naturally from Maya's tendency to paint what she was observing and experiencing, and what she was most consistently observing and experiencing in Elder Mist was rain, the visual effects it created, the atmospheric qualities it generated, the emotional responses it evoked in her that seemed to vary based on subtle differences in rainfall intensity and duration and context. Her paintings didn't attempt photorealistic representation of rain, didn't try to capture every individual droplet with precise technical accuracy. Instead, they worked through selective emphasis and suggestive marks to convey the essence of rainfall's effects, the way it transformed light, the reflections it created on wet surfaces, the way it seemed to both obscure and clarify depending on distance and angle of view. She painted rain falling on empty streets at night with the water reflecting colored light from shop signs. Rain falling in parks where children played despite the weather. Rain falling on lone figures who seemed to be experiencing contemplation or sadness or some other internal state that the rain seemed to amplify or reflect. The emotional content of these paintings was what distinguished them from merely competent technical exercises in depicting weather. Each painting carried specific mood or feeling that Maya was attempting to express, not illustrate literally but evoke through the formal elements of composition and color and mark-making. A painting of heavy downpour with dark clouds and dramatic diagonal rain lines might express urgency or release. A painting of gentle drizzle with soft gray tones and diffused light might express melancholy or quiet introspection. A painting of rain beginning to clear with breaks in clouds and patches of brighter sky might express hope or transition. Maya had accumulated approximately 40 paintings over the 2 years she'd been working in the attic, stored them behind old curtains that had been removed from windows during previous renovation and that now served to conceal the canvases from casual view if anyone besides Maya ventured into the attic space. She'd never shown these paintings to anyone, had never invited friends or family members to view them, had never photographed them to share on social media, had never submitted them to any exhibitions or competitions despite her art teacher's periodic encouragement that students should seek opportunities to display their work beyond the classroom. The reluctance to share wasn't primarily about lack of confidence in technical quality. Maya knew her work was competent if not exceptional by the standards of high school art instruction, knew that some of her paintings achieved what she'd been attempting while others fell short, but that overall the body of work demonstrated genuine artistic vision and developing skill. The reluctance was more about the vulnerability that sharing would require, the fact that these paintings were expressions of her internal emotional life in ways that felt intensely private, that showing them would mean exposing aspects of herself that she typically kept carefully protected from others' observation and judgment. The announcement about the school exhibition came during art class on a Wednesday afternoon in late October, during period when Elder Mist was experiencing particularly heavy rainfall that characterized the autumn transition into the wettest portion of the year. Ms. Lang, full name Christine Lang, 48 years old, had been teaching art at Elder Mist Secondary School for 18 years, made the announcement during the final 15 minutes of the 90-minute class period, after students had been working on their current assignment involving color theory and value studies. I want to tell you about an opportunity that's available to students who are interested in displaying their work publicly, Ms. Lang said, her voice carrying the enthusiasm she brought to any topic related to helping students develop as artists. The school will be hosting an exhibition in December showcasing student artwork from all grades. The exhibition will be open to the community, parents, other students, local residents, and will be an opportunity for you to share your work with broader audience than just your classmates and teachers. Additionally, a panel of judges including myself and 2 professional artists from the region will select a few pieces from the school exhibition to be displayed at the Regional Arts Center's annual Student Showcase in January. The announcement generated varied responses from the 23 students in the class. Some expressed immediate enthusiasm, began discussing among themselves what pieces they might submit. Others showed indifference, had no particular interest in displaying their work or in the attention that might come from being selected for the regional showcase. A few showed anxiety similar to Maya's, recognized that displaying work publicly would require vulnerability they weren't sure they were comfortable with. Ms. Lang continued with practical details about submission requirements. Each student could submit up to 3 pieces. Submission deadline was November 15th. Pieces should be properly mounted or framed, though the school could provide basic framing assistance for students who needed it. She encouraged all students to participate regardless of their self-assessed skill level, emphasized that the exhibition was about celebrating creative expression rather than about judging technical perfection, noted that seeing their work displayed professionally could be valuable experience even for students who didn't particularly care about being selected for the regional showcase. Maya listened to the announcement with growing internal conflict. Part of her immediately recognized this as opportunity to share the rain paintings she'd been creating in isolation, to discover whether they communicated to others what she'd been attempting to express, to potentially receive validation that her artistic work had value beyond just personal therapeutic benefit. But another part of her resisted, felt protective of the work's privacy, feared that displaying it would invite criticism or misunderstanding that would damage her relationship to the paintings and to the creative process, questioned whether she was ready for the exposure that public display would require. The conflict persisted through the remainder of the afternoon and into the evening. At dinner that night, family meal that Maya's parents insisted on maintaining despite everyone's various schedules and obligations, Maya's younger brother Anish mentioned that students in his grade were also being encouraged to submit work to the exhibition. "I'm going to submit my sculpture project," he announced with characteristic 11-year-old confidence that didn't include the self-doubt that Maya was experiencing. Ms. Chin said it was really good and that people would like seeing it. Maya's mother asked whether Maya was planning to submit anything. Maya responded non-committally, "I'm thinking about it. Haven't decided yet." Her father encouraged her, "You should participate. You spend a lot of time painting up in the attic, would be good to show people what you're working on." The encouragement was well-intentioned, but it increased rather than decreased Maya's anxiety, made the decision about whether to submit feel like it carried expectations from family that added pressure beyond her own internal conflict. After dinner, Maya climbed the ladder to the attic, turned on the work lights she'd installed, pulled aside the curtains concealing her stored paintings. She spent approximately an hour reviewing the accumulated work, moving through the canvases one by one, assessing each painting's success at achieving what she'd been attempting, considering which pieces might be appropriate for public display. Some paintings felt too personal, too direct in their expression of specific emotional states that she wasn't comfortable making public. Others felt technically weak in ways that would be embarrassing if displayed alongside more skilled work. But several paintings felt both successful as artistic expressions and potentially suitable for public viewing, communicated mood and atmosphere without being overly literal or private, demonstrated technical competence without revealing major flaws. She eventually selected 3 paintings that represented different aspects of her rain work and different emotional registers. First, A large canvas showing rain-soaked street at night with reflections of amber and blue light from shop signs, with single figure holding red umbrella walking away from viewer. Second, a smaller painting showing children playing in park during light rain, their bright raincoats creating color against the gray-green background. Third, a medium-sized canvas showing aftermath of storm with water pooling on empty street, with breaks in clouds allowing filtered sunlight to create dramatic lighting. Having selected the potential submissions, Maya faced the remaining decision about whether to actually submit them. The deadline was still more than 2 weeks away. She didn't need to decide immediately, could continue deliberating about whether to participate. But she also recognized that extended deliberation would probably lead to increased anxiety rather than to increased clarity, that the decision was fundamentally about whether she was willing to accept the vulnerability that sharing would require rather than about which specific paintings to submit. She left the attic without having made final decision, but with the 3 paintings set aside from the others in ways that suggested she was leaning towards submission even if she hadn't committed to it yet. The following 2 weeks involved ongoing internal debate. Maya would decide she was going to submit the paintings, then would wake up the next morning feeling renewed anxiety that would make submission feel impossible. She would rehearse potential criticism the work might receive, people saying it was derivative or technically weak or emotionally manipulative. She would imagine standing in the exhibition space while viewers looked at her work, would feel exposed and vulnerable in ways that made submission seem like a terrible idea. But she would also imagine not submitting, would recognize that refusing to participate would mean continuing to work in isolation without ever discovering whether her art could communicate to others, would mean allowing fear of judgment to prevent her from pursuing opportunity that might be valuable for her development as artist. The tension between these competing concerns created ongoing discomfort that Maya struggled to resolve through pure deliberation. What eventually led to submission was conversation with Ms. Lang during school art class on November 12, 3 days before the submission deadline. Ms. Lang had noticed Maya's apparent indecision, had observed her working with unusual distraction during class time, had picked up on Maya's body language that suggested internal conflict. After class, she'd asked Maya to stay behind briefly for conversation. "I wanted to check in with you about the exhibition," Ms. Lang said once the other students had departed. "I know you've been thinking about whether to submit work, and I wanted to let you know that I think you should. Not because I'm trying to pressure you, but because I think your painting has genuine artistic merit and because I think you'd benefit from the experience of displaying your work publicly even if it feels uncomfortable." Maya started to offer some vague response about still deciding, but Ms. Lang continued, "I know you do a lot of painting outside of class. I know you're working on things that you don't show anyone. And I respect that privacy. Art can be deeply personal and you're under no obligation to share work that you want to keep private. But I also think that at some point, artists need to share their work with audiences beyond themselves. Not necessarily to seek validation or approval, but just to discover whether what they're attempting to express actually communicates to others the way they hope it will." The conversation had lasted perhaps 10 minutes, had included Ms. Lang sharing some of her own experiences as emerging artist who'd struggled with similar anxiety about displaying work publicly, had concluded with Ms. Lang reiterating that the decision was ultimately Maya's but that she hoped Maya would choose to participate. The conversation hadn't eliminated Maya's anxiety but had somehow made the anxiety feel more manageable, had reframed submission as artistic risk that could provide valuable learning regardless of specific outcomes rather than as potential exposure that would inevitably lead to criticism or rejection. 2 days later, on November 14, the day before the deadline, Maya brought the 3 selected paintings to school in careful wrapping, submitted them with required paperwork to the exhibition organizers. The submission felt simultaneously significant and anticlimactic, was a major decision that represented accepting considerable vulnerability, but the actual mechanical act of completing forms and handing over paintings took only a few minutes and involved no drama or ceremony beyond the administrative process of recording what had been submitted. The exhibition opened on Saturday, December 3, with opening reception scheduled for 2 p.m. to 5 p.m. in the school's main gallery space, a dedicated room adjacent to the art classrooms that had been designed specifically for displaying student work, that featured professional gallery lighting and modular wall systems that could be reconfigured for different exhibitions. The exhibition would remain up for 2 weeks, would be open during school hours for students to view and would be open on weekends for community members who wanted to attend. Maya had been dreading the opening reception with increasing intensity as December 3rd approached. The reception would require her to be physically present in the space while people viewed her work, would likely involve people asking her questions about the paintings or commenting on them in her presence, would mean experiencing directly whatever responses her work generated rather than just hearing about responses secondhand. She'd seriously considered simply not attending. Her presence wasn't technically required. Students whose work was displayed weren't obligated to attend the reception, but Ms. Lang had encouraged attendance and her parents had expressed expectation that they'd go as family to support both Maya and Anish, whose sculpture was also being displayed. So Maya attended, wearing clothing she'd selected carefully to appear appropriately formal for the occasion while not appearing to be trying too hard, arriving at 2:10 p.m. with her parents and Anish after the reception had already begun so they wouldn't be among the first arrivals. The gallery space was moderately crowded, perhaps 60 people present out of what would eventually total maybe 150 attendees over the 3-hour reception period. The work was arranged thematically by medium and grade level, with Maya's 3 paintings displayed together on one wall section in area designated for upper-level painting students. Maya's immediate response upon seeing her work displayed was a complex mixture of emotions. Pride at seeing the paintings professionally mounted and lit, displayed in context that positioned them as legitimate artworks rather than just as private creative exercises. Vulnerability at having the work exposed to public view, at knowing that people could now examine and judge paintings that had previously been protected in the attic's privacy. Anxiety about how people would respond, about whether they would understand what she'd been attempting to express or whether they would find the work confusing or unimpressive. For the first 30 minutes of the reception, Maya stayed with her parents, moved through the gallery looking at other students' work, tried to avoid spending too much time near her own paintings where she might have to observe people's reactions directly. But gradually she became aware that her rain paintings were drawing sustained attention, that people were stopping in front of them for longer periods than they were spending on most other work, that small groups were gathering to look at them and discuss them, that the 3 paintings seemed to be generating particular interest among the reception attendees. Maya cautiously positioned herself where she could observe people looking at her work without being obviously identified as the artist. The responses were varied but largely positive. Older adults seemed to respond with particular engagement, would stand quietly looking at the paintings for extended periods, would occasionally comment to companions about how the work captured something about Elder Mist's character or about the emotional qualities of rain. Younger viewers were more likely to move past more quickly, but several groups of students stopped to examine the paintings carefully, with Maya overhearing fragments of conversations about technique and composition and the effectiveness of the paintings in creating mood. The 3 judges who would be selecting work for the regional showcase, Ms. Lang and 2 professional artists from neighboring city who'd been invited to serve as jurors, were observed by Maya spending considerable time examining her paintings, were having extended discussion that suggested they were seriously considering the work for regional selection. One of the outside jurors, a woman probably in her 50s, asked someone from the exhibition organizing committee to identify which student had created the rain paintings, was directed toward Maya, who was still trying to maintain observer position rather than presenting herself as the artist. "Are you Maya Kapoor?" the juror asked, approaching with friendly but professional demeanor. "These rain paintings are yours?" Maya confirmed that yes, the paintings were hers, found herself suddenly in conversation she wasn't fully prepared for about her artistic process and influences and intentions. The juror asked thoughtful questions, not generic compliments but specific inquiries about color choices and compositional decisions and what Maya had been attempting to express through the work. The conversation lasted perhaps 10 minutes, concluded with the juror saying, "Your work is remarkably mature for a high school student. You're working with genuine emotional content in ways that many artists much older than you struggle to achieve. I hope you continue developing these ideas." The comment provided validation that Maya hadn't realized she'd been needing. Not validation that the work was technically perfect or that Maya was destined for great artistic success, but simply validation that what she'd been attempting to express through the paintings was actually communicating to at least some viewers, that the emotional content she'd been trying to capture was visible to others and not just to herself. The rain paintings were selected for the regional showcase, along with 11 other pieces from the school exhibition. The news was announced the following Monday during morning announcements, generated congratulations from classmates and teachers, meant that Maya's work would be displayed at the Regional Arts Center for month-long exhibition beginning in January. Her parents were pleased and proud, arranged to take time off work to attend the regional exhibition's opening reception, began telling extended family members about Maya's artistic recognition. But what Maya found more meaningful than the formal selection was the ongoing responses to the paintings that accumulated over the 2 weeks they were displayed at the school. Students she didn't know would approach her in hallways or cafeteria to tell her they'd seen the paintings and had found them moving or beautiful or thought-provoking. Teachers from departments beyond just art would mention having visited the exhibition and being impressed by her work. Community members who'd attended would occasionally recognize her around town and would comment on the paintings. Several people shared more detailed responses that revealed how the work had affected them personally. An older man who'd lost his wife several months earlier told Maya that the painting of the lone figure with the red umbrella had helped him feel less alone in his grief, had somehow communicated understanding of the particular loneliness that loss creates. A woman who worked at the coffee shop Maya's family frequented told her that the painting of children playing in the rain had reminded her of her own childhood in Elder Mist and had made her feel grateful for the continuity of experience across generations in the town. These responses surprised Maya. She'd created the paintings primarily as expressions of her own emotional responses to rain and to Elder Mist's atmospheric character, hadn't been consciously attempting to communicate specific messages or to create effects for viewers. But the responses revealed that the work was functioning as genuine communication, was allowing others to access or recognize or articulate feelings and experiences that they'd been having but that they hadn't necessarily been able to express for themselves. The regional exhibition in January extended this experience. The Regional Arts Center was professional gallery space in the neighboring city, displayed work by established regional artists alongside educational exhibitions like the Student Showcase where Maya's work appeared. The opening reception attracted larger and more diverse audience than the school exhibition had, included serious art collectors and critics and educators alongside students and families, created more intimidating context than the school gallery had provided. But Maya found the regional exhibition less anxiety-inducing than the school exhibition had been, partly because the experience of the school exhibition had familiarized her with being present while people viewed her work, partly because the regional context created enough social distance that she didn't feel as directly exposed as she had when displaying work to her immediate school community. She attended the opening reception, observed people examining her paintings, experienced the now familiar mixture of vulnerability and satisfaction that came from watching strangers engage with work she'd created. The exhibition attracted some written critical attention, reviews in regional arts publications that covered the various exhibitions at the Arts Center. The reviews of the Student Showcase were generally positive if brief, with Maya's rain paintings receiving specific mention in 2 reviews as examples of student work that demonstrated artistic maturity beyond typical high school technical exercises. One reviewer wrote, "Maya Kapoor's rain studies demonstrate sophisticated understanding of how atmospheric conditions can serve as vehicles for emotional expression, how the ordinary and overlooked, in this case the rain that defines her hometown's character, can become subject matter that reveals psychological and social dimensions typically associated with more conventional artistic subjects." The review was gratifying but also slightly intimidating, introduced language and frameworks for discussing her work that Maya hadn't consciously been engaging with while creating it, suggested expectations and artistic contexts that made continuing to work feel potentially more fraught than it had when she'd been painting in private isolation in the attic. The public recognition created changes in Maya's relationship to her artistic work and to her identity as person who made art. The changes were subtle, not dramatic transformation of self-concept or sudden shift in daily behavior, but were nonetheless real and consequential. She was now known among her peers and teachers as the artist, as person whose creative work had received external validation sufficient to distinguish her from other students who engaged in art as hobby or casual interest. The recognition was mostly positive, created social capital and respect that Maya appreciated, but also created pressure to continue producing work at level that would justify the recognition, that would demonstrate that the rain paintings weren't anomaly but rather were evidence of sustained artistic vision. Maya continued working in the attic, continued painting rain as primary subject, but found that the work felt different now that it was no longer purely private. Part of her would imagine potential future audiences while painting, would consider how this new painting might be received if displayed publicly, would catch herself making choices designed to create particular effects for hypothetical viewers rather than just following her immediate creative impulses. The shift wasn't entirely negative. Awareness of audience could be productive constraint that forced clarity and intentionality, but it did represent loss of the complete privacy that had characterized her work before the exhibitions. She also received requests to create rain paintings for specific purposes. The school asked whether they could purchase one of her paintings to display permanently in the main office. A local coffee shop asked whether she'd be interested in having small exhibition of new rain paintings in their space. Several community members asked whether she did commissions and whether they could purchase rain paintings for their homes. The requests were flattering and were potentially lucrative. Selling paintings could provide income that would help fund supplies and future creative projects, but they also introduced commercial dimension that complicated Maya's relationship to the work. She declined most of these requests, at least initially. Wasn't ready to shift from making art primarily for personal expression to making art as commodity or service for others' consumption, wasn't sure how to navigate the relationship between artistic integrity and commercial viability, needed time to figure out how to maintain the emotional authenticity that had made the rain paintings meaningful while also potentially creating work for external purposes beyond just personal expression. But she did accept the school's request to purchase a painting for permanent display, selected a rain study that she felt was strong enough to justify public display but that wasn't so personally significant that seeing it regularly in the office would feel uncomfortable. The transaction was modest. The school paid $200, which was far below what professional artists might charge but which felt like substantial validation to Maya that her work had tangible value beyond just critical appreciation. The painting was hung in the main office in February, positioned where students and visitors would see it regularly, became familiar presence that people would sometimes mention to Maya when they encountered her around school. By spring, approximately 6 months after the initial school exhibition, Maya had achieved equilibrium regarding public sharing of her work. She continued painting regularly in the attic, continued working primarily on rain subjects that explored different aspects of precipitation's visual and emotional qualities, continued producing work that felt authentic to her own creative vision rather than tailored to audience expectations. But she was also more willing to share selected pieces when opportunities arose, submitted work to another student exhibition, agreed to include 3 paintings in group show at local library, began documenting her paintings through photography so she could maintain archive of completed work even when physical paintings were sold or displayed elsewhere. The shift from completely private creation to selective public sharing felt sustainable in ways that complete privacy had been limiting and in ways that complete public orientation would have been exhausting. She maintained the attic as protected creative space where she could work without audience awareness, but she no longer felt that sharing work was betrayal of creative integrity or dangerous exposure of vulnerability that needed to be protected at all costs. The exhibitions had taught her that sharing could be valuable, not primarily because it generated recognition or praise, though those were pleasant, but because it allowed her work to function as communication rather than just as private expression, because it created opportunities for her artistic vision to affect others in ways that pure privacy would never achieve. Your perspective is unique. The ways you see the world, the patterns you notice, the emotions you experience in response to ordinary circumstances that others overlook or take for granted, these constitute artistic vision that has value beyond just personal significance. But that value can only be realized if you're willing to share your perspective, to express it in forms that others can engage with, to accept the vulnerability that sharing requires despite the risks of criticism or misunderstanding that vulnerability entails. Maya's rain paintings worked as art not because rain is inherently profound subject matter but because Maya brought specific emotional and perceptual sensitivity to observing and depicting rain that transformed common weather phenomenon into vehicle for genuine emotional expression. The sensitivity was partially innate. Some people are just naturally more attuned to atmospheric and emotional qualities than others are, but it was also developed through sustained attention and through commitment to expressing what she was noticing rather than dismissing it as too ordinary or personal to merit artistic treatment. The same process is available to anyone regardless of specific subject matter or medium. You don't need to paint rain in order to have artistic vision worth sharing, need only to identify what you notice or care about or experience that feels meaningful to you, and then to develop skills and commitment necessary to express that meaningful content in forms that can communicate to others. The expression might be visual art like Maya's paintings, or might be writing or music or any other medium that allows you to translate internal experience into external form that others can engage with. But the expression requires willingness to share, to make yourself vulnerable to responses that you can't control, to risk that your work will be criticized or misunderstood or ignored despite your best efforts to communicate clearly and authentically. Maya's initial reluctance to share her rain paintings was understandable. Sharing felt like exposing herself to judgment that might damage her relationship to work that was meaningful precisely because it was private. But maintaining that privacy would have meant that the paintings never functioned as communication, never affected anyone beyond Maya herself, never demonstrated that her particular way of seeing rain could help others see it differently or could help them access feelings they were having but hadn't articulated. So identify what matters to you, what you notice, what you care about, what you experience in response to aspects of ordinary life that others might overlook. Develop skills necessary to express that content, through whatever medium feels natural or appropriate, through whatever forms allow you to translate internal experience into external communication. Create work that feels authentic to your experience rather than work designed primarily to generate approval or recognition, but also be willing to share that authentic work despite the vulnerability sharing requires. The sharing won't always generate positive responses. Some people won't understand what you're attempting to express, some will actively dislike it, some will ignore it entirely. But some people will respond with recognition and gratitude, will find in your expression something that helps them understand their own experience, will be affected in ways that justify the vulnerability you accepted by sharing. Even quiet moments, even ordinary subjects, even personal perspectives that feel too minor to merit public expression, these can inspire countless hearts if you're willing to share them. Express it. Share it. Even the quietest moments can inspire countless hearts. Be StoryWise.